lore of the Great Maw, or the lore of the Maw, is a pretty varied lore from a faction that can sometimes be a little one-note. In this lore, you have options for scaring off the enemy, buffing your units to high heaven, regenerating almost their entire HP bar, and of course, blowing the battlefield to smithereens. And if you haven't gathered it already, the only faction that can use this lore is the Ogre Kingdoms. First of all, of course, we have the passive of the lore, Blood Gruel. This targets the caster with 0.4% HP per second for 9 seconds every single time they cast a spell. As usual, since this is a passive, you can't really not get value out of it since it's free. That being said, if you want to min-max this, then you can wait until your caster has taken a bit of damage before casting any spells to ensure the regen is getting them some value rather than going to waste on a full HP unit. Of course, when playing ogres, everyone is getting into combat, so this shouldn't be too hard, but maybe save that first cast until they've taken a hit or two, just to make sure. Our first castable spell is Brain Gobbler. This is a hex spell, costs 4 winds of magic, and has a 28-second cooldown. It targets enemy units and has a 200 meter cast range. The affected units suffer minus 16 leadership for 18 seconds. This is a pretty standard leadership sapping spell, and you want to use it pretty much how you use the rest of them. If you have an enemy that is getting close to breaking, this can push them over the edge and create a gap for your units to funnel through. This is even more important for ogres with their small numbers, meaning taking out ranged troops is a must. Use this to break an enemy unit and have your units rush the gap to make the most of the opportunity. Of course, be aware that if the broken unit isn't finished off, chances are they will come back once the spell wears off, so you want to make sure to get rid of them completely or are ready for their return. The Overcast costs 6 winds of magic and has a 36-second duration. Of course, this Overcast can be used pretty much the same as the base spell, but now will send the unit running for twice as long. Other than that, you want to use it the same as the base spell to create gaps for your units to funnel through, to get rid of enemy units for a little while, to give you some space. You still will need to take them out or be ready for them to return once the spell wears off. Next, we have Gorgeou. This is an augment spell, costs 4 winds of magic and has a 29-second cooldown. It can be targeted on a single allied unit and has a 200 meter cast range. The affected unit gains 25% armor piercing damage and 24 melee attack for 17 seconds. This buff can elevate units from doing a decent amount of damage to doing a massive amount of damage, and it only gets better the higher tier of unit you use it against. The percentage based buffs combined with the melee attack mean the affected unit will output a massive amount more damage than they normally would, meaning high damaging units become an absolute blender. You want to use this on the best damage dealers you have to rocket their damage numbers into the stratosphere. You also want to make sure that they're going to be in combat for the full duration to get your money's worth, and make sure that the target isn't going to die or run 2 seconds into the cast. If you follow these simple rules, you should get a ton of great value and deal a boatload of damage with ease. The Overcast costs 7 winds of magic and increases the duration to 34 seconds. The Overcast allows a unit to deal an ungodly amount of damage for a pretty long duration, adding up some pretty crazy damage numbers. You want to use this Overcast when you're going against some high HP or armor enemies, and the extra duration will get you through their defenses. There's no point using this if you're going to beat the enemy in the time it takes for the base cast, so if they're tough and healthy, then cast away. Next we have Toothcracker. This is another augment spell, costs 8 winds of magic and has a 25-second cooldown. It can only be targeted on allied units and has a 200 meter cast range. The spell affects units in a 35 meter area of effect and grants them 30 armor and 22% missile resistance for 25 seconds. This massive defensive buff being in an area of effect for so cheap is pretty crazy to me. Not only will all the units you hit in the generous area be tougher overall from that armor, they'll also just ignore over 1/5 of all missiles launched at them, making for an extremely tough bunch of units, likely with a ton of HP to boot. This is the ogres after all. This can allow you to close the distance between your units and enemies without taking too many hits from backlines, and allow your troops to arrive more healthy and more willing to fight. You want to use this anytime you need to protect your units, especially from a range. So if you're approaching their lines, attacking walls or command points, or you just need your units to be tougher in combat, then go right ahead. The Overcast costs 13 winds of magic and has a 50-second duration. You want to use this Overcast when your units are going to be vulnerable for a longer period of time, as that massive duration will keep them protected from nearly all forms of damage for a significant amount of time. Of course, the cost is expensive, but if it will keep your units healthy, then it's worth it. Just make sure they need the longer duration, as the last thing you want is them sitting there taking no damage for the second half of the cast when you could have saved 5 wins. Bone Crusher is next, and this is an explosion spell, costs 10 winds of magic and has a 43-second cooldown. It can all be targeted on the ground and has a 200 meter cast range. It deals a pretty decent amount of damage in a small 8 meter area of effect. This spell is of course great for dealing some good damage to a small group of enemies within its small strike area. Of course you want to aim for the biggest clump you can to ensure you hit as many entities as possible, but this doesn't have the greatest area and will be more of a designated strike than a clump clearer. If you can, you want to pick some armored targets to make the most of the armor piercing damage. There's not really much more to it than that, just make sure the target does not go running, as they can easily escape the area if they're on the move during the cast. Oh, and you also want to make sure you don't aim this at your own dudes, as this damage doesn't really care what's under it, they'll all get hit just the same. The Overcast costs 15 Winds of Magic and has an increased armor piercing damage. Of course, this Overcast wants to be used on the most armored targets you come across to ensure you punch through their thick armor. Anything above 60 armor value will be a great target, and other than that, you want to follow all the same rules as before, aim for stationary clumps, and you can't go too far wrong. Next we have Troll Guts. This is a regeneration spell, costs 16 Winds of Magic, has a 40-second cooldown. It affects allied units and has a 200 meter cast range. It can only affect one unit at a time and grants them 0.8 HP per second for 40 seconds. This massive heal can replenish up to 32% of a unit's total HP bar, meaning over the 40-second duration, you can take a unit from death's door to half HP and get them right back into the fight. Of course, the heal being over time does mean they can still take damage whilst they're being healed and counteract the healing, but you'll still gain the HP the entire time. So even if you're taking damage, you'll still be regenerating it back the entire time, so your enemy's efforts will be somewhat wasted. You can use this on any unit that needs a HP boost, whether that's a unit running away at 10%, or just a front lines unit that's dropped below 50% and needs to stay in the fight. As long as you pick a unit that's useful to you and is at 68% HP or lower, or it's going to reach that point in the time of the cast, you should get some great value. The Overcast costs a massive 26 Winds of Magic and ups the duration to 80 seconds. This huge duration can allow you to regenerate 64% of a unit's HP. And when we're talking about the Ogres, that can be HP in excess of 10,000 in some very special cases. You want to use this Overcast on units that are extremely low on HP and you need them back in the battle, as that massive regen will bring them back to fighting form by the end of the time. Of course, you still have the HP over time problem, it's still HP you're getting back and the enemies have to get rid of again, so it's pretty great. Just aim for super low HP units and you'll be fine. And our final spell is the Maw. This is an explosion spell, costs 20 Winds of Magic, and has a 54-second cooldown. It can all be targeted on the ground and has a 200 meter cast range. It deals great damage in a huge 20 meter area of effect. This massive explosion does fantastic damage to any unit unfortunate enough to be caught in the radius, and what a radius it is. You want to use this on the biggest clumps of enemy units you can to make sure that every little bit of that AoE is hitting enemies and hitting them hard. The damage from this spell doesn't seem like much from the spell card, but in practice it vaporizes most units caught inside. Full HP and high armor units can quickly become half HP if caught in it for the full duration, so find that clump and fire away. Just make sure you keep your own units clear of this, as this spell will slap them just as hard if you aren't careful. And finally, the Overcast costs 26 Winds of Magic and has increased armor piercing damage. Similar to Bone Crusher, you want to use this when you have lots of high armor targets on the enemy side in a big clump to make the most of the outstanding damage. Pretty much any unit caught in this is going to feel a serious bit of burn, so make sure it's the enemies and not you, otherwise you'll be cleaning up your own lads with a mop. And that concludes this guide on the lore of the Great Maw. Let me know what you think of this lore in the comments below. Let me know what you thought of this video by leaving a like or a dislike, and if you want to see more content like this, then be sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. I'd like to take this time to thank all supporters of the channel, like Adam T, and of course Henry Tucker for their support at the Unclean Ones tier. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so here on YouTube, over on Twitch and Patreon. You get shoutouts at the end of videos, just like all of these wonderful people. Huge thank you to all supporters, one final thank you for watching, and for now, I've been COLONELDAMNEDERS, and I will see you next turn.